My name's Tom Davis. I've been kicking around fisheries on the BC coast since I was 5 years old. When my dad, Reese Davis, used to take me out fishing and taught me how to run the boat. Actually knew how to run the boat and run on landmarks before I went to elementary school. That sort of progressed through the years, and I got away from it a bit in the early 1970s. I went to work for him at Reese Davis Limited. Bought the company in the 80s, kept it until I sold it in 2013 to Gibbs Delta. In the interim, I spent almost 2 decades on the Sport Fishing Advisory Board, was involved in local salmon enhancement, spent a decade on the Canada-US Pacific Salmon Commission, and basically finished up my advisory kind of capacities on the board of directors of a small provincial crown corporation called Fisheries Renewal BC. Since then, I've been writing about fishing issues in British Columbia for about 15 years, and I'm retired, living in Victoria with my wife and son. You know, after the number of years that I've been with this, I got involved in advocacy for the recreational fishery because our Chinook salmon fishery in particular is under very severe threat recently, and it doesn't appear to be getting better. The root of our problem really stems from a group of stocks that are in the upper Fraser River, and these are called Fraser stream-type Chinook. These are the major stock of concern. They are basically what are known as 5-2s and 4-2s. And these are the early returning upper Fraser River fish. The 5 in that definition refers to the dominant age class. They're 5 years of age when they return to spawn, and they come back in the spring and the summer. There's also a 4-2 component, which are 4-year-old fish that return to the Nicola River. Now, the 2 refers to the fact that all of these runs spend 2 years in the river before they migrate to sea. So they actually migrate to sea in their 2nd year. And this is problematic because they are far migrating. And by far migrating, I mean they travel right across the Northeast Pacific to the Gulf of Alaska. And in that area, they are currently competing with billions of pink and chum salmon that are being produced in Japan, Korea, Russia to a small extent, and Alaska. So when the ocean survival conditions are tough out there, it is harder on these particular runs of fish than many of the other runs that come back to rivers in BC. These middle and upper Fraser Chinook are in quite steep decline. They have recovered a little bit in recent years, but they're returning at about half to maybe a little more, a little bit less of their average return over the last almost 50 years. And the decline has been steepest in the last decade. Up to 2017, I think, was the lowest point, and they have, as I said, recovered somewhat from that period. The main stocks that are constraining all the fisheries down the whole length of the Fraser River, and that includes First Nations, recreational fisheries on the river, right out through the entirety of Georgia Strait, Juan de Fuca Strait, and up certain areas of the west coast of Vancouver Island. One of the big things that we're facing, and this was shocking to me when I discovered it, is that there has been a shocking lack of recovery effort undertaken by the Department of Fisheries and Oceans over the last 15 years. They've closed hatcheries, so we don't get any coated wire tag. There was a hatchery up there called Dome Creek. It's now closed. They've canceled a proposed hatchery in the Willow River, and there's a lack of technical support. In fact, the people that are working on streams in the Prince George and that whole region up there of northern BC, the closest technical support is 500 kilometers away in Kamloops. This is something that we were unaware of, but in recent months we've been in contact with people that are working on the ground up there, and they've identified that as those points as some of the major problems they've been dealing with. Unfortunately, in 2019, we had the Big Bar slide on the Fraser River. That happened about 60 kilometers north, 50 to 60 kilometers north of Lillooet. And it wasn't discovered for as much as 3, 4, maybe even 5 months. It totally blocked fish passage above the slide area at Big Bar. Now, fortunately, in this case, the government, in cooperation with the provincial government, the federal government, and the First Nations, all cooperated in a collaborative type of effort, and they managed to get that resolved very quickly. They built a natural fishway. They had to put a road in to access the site. It was an extremely difficult job. However, there are consequences, and the consequences are that the brood years, particularly in 2024 and perhaps in 2025, the amount of fish that actually made it to the spawning ground was quite small, relatively speaking. And the reason is that they were delayed so long below the blockage that they didn't have enough energy left to get to their home rivers further up the Fraser and spawn successfully. There's also good news. You're not inclined to hear this in the media, or you're not inclined to hear it from groups like the environmental organizations, we call them NGOs, because they really don't like recreational fishermen. But Chinook stocks in particular have been improving significantly over the last few years. On Vancouver Island, the Cowichan run has done very well. In 2006, there were only 600 adult Chinook that made it back to the river. For the last 5 years in a row, that run has exceeded 20,000 Chinook. But it's not the only one. If we expand out from there a little bit, there's a stock grouping of a grouping of about 17 or 18 Chinook stocks that DFO monitors regularly, and they've been doing really well. They're up from their 4 and 12-year average escapements. But the big news is what's happened to the Thompson River 4-1 Chinook stocks. In 2023, there were 627,000 of them that actually returned to the river. That's what actually got on the spawning grounds. It is such a large number that it is difficult to comprehend how big it is. But take my word for it, it is huge. In fact, it was actually referred to a few nights ago at a Pacific Salmon Foundation dinner when they mentioned that, yes, Chinook seem to be recovering quite well. And of course, the other big return in southern BC was the Harrison stock, which doubled its escapement goal to over 150,000 Chinook. When you hear somebody telling you that, oh, the whales are dying because there's a shortage of Chinook out there, or the ENGOs are saying, the whales are starving because there's no Chinook, it's nonsense. Over the last few years, Chinook have been recovering in many of these key areas of British Columbia. Unfortunately, there are major consequences due to Fraser River stocks are concerned, particularly these upper river stocks, and they're widespread. The first thing is that uncertainty hurts fishing businesses. Businesses need to have some idea of what their future is, and uncertainty really throws that into a tailspin. We've had 6 years of Chinook non-retention, which means that over these really important fishing areas of Georgia Strait up through Johnson Strait into the northern part up close to Port Hardy, all the way around through Juan de Fuca Strait and portions of the west coast of Vancouver Island, non-retention is in place from April the 1st to as late as July 31st, and that has been the situation for 6 years. It causes social and economic disruption, loss of recreational fishing infrastructure, and by that I mean marinas on valuable property are going to take a look at it and say, you know what, we can't continue to do this, and within a year or so you might see condos there and a marina gone. It damages BC's reputation as a tourist fishing destinations, and tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars are lost to the BC economy. That was the first issue that we had, was problems with the upper Fraser River Chinook. We have others that are threatening the fishery. And the second is the actions that the federal government, in particular, the group that are working specifically on endangered southern resident killer whales, the solutions that they've come up with have been very, very punitive to recreational angling. Anglers love killer whales. It may seem odd, but I don't think there's an angler out there who doesn't want to see these southern resident killer whales recover. So we're all on the same page there, but we do argue vociferously with a prescription that the killer whale recovery team has been proposing. So what we also need is public salmon fisheries in southern BC to survive. And currently that's very difficult. Great example would be Port Renfrew, where the proposals for whale restrictions for 2024 are so severe that the community of Port Renfrew, which is highly dependent now on recreational fishing, are considering every option that they have available to try and halt this kind of random attack on their ability to harvest salmon. You know, this is a major problem for us. Information about southern resident killer whales, the population trend has been pretty flat since the 1970s. Right now I think there's about 74 animals that are in the three pods. Their high was in 1996 when it was 98, and the low was in the late 1960s after they had live extractions for marine land type endeavors. So, you know, they're not doing well, but we think there are simpler solutions other than static closures that last from roughly the middle of the summer until the end of October. So here's how the two of the threats pile together. You've got the Chinook non-retention regulations lasting until middle of July to the end of July, and then the southern resident killer whale regulations kick in for another 3.5 to 4 months. Now there are threats to these at-risk killer whales. One is noise, 2 is food supply, and 3 is pollution. They've dealt with noise by having all vessels slow down and provide a substantial distance of travel away from the whales whenever they're there. In terms of the food, they're basically putting that entire load on the recreational fishery because we're seen as competitors with these killer whales for an adequate food supply. But as we discussed earlier, the Chinook have been doing pretty well. So there is no shortage of Chinook out there, and that is not just my opinion. That has been identified by Dr. Andrew Treitz from the UBC Marine Mammal Unit, who did studies 4 or 5 years ago, who said at that time that there was adequate Chinook in the Canadian waters, basically Georgia Strait, Juan de Fuca Strait, when the killer whales are there. Now the third one is pollutants, and to our knowledge, these animals are fairly severely polluted, but there has been no action on either side of the border to address that particular problem. And these are long-term pollutants like DDT, PCBs, that type of thing. This is an interesting bit of information for you. The Vancouver Port Authority had a company called Jasco in 2017 do a noise assessment by vessel category in the Salish Sea. Fishing, all fishing, not just recreational fishing, contributed 0.6% to the total noise profile, 0.6%. Ferries, on the other hand, contributed 66%. and then the rest was split up between other marine vessel activity. So for 0.6% of the noise profile, we are faced with significant shutdowns to our fishing opportunities. The pollution is an important factor, and as I mentioned, we don't seem to see any action on that front yet. So basically, the recreational fishery with these static closures are providing the greatest visible actions to help save these particular pods of whales. By the way, Chinook is their preferred food. The type of action that we would like to see is based on a moving avoidance bubble. And a moving avoidance bubble is simply when the whales appear in an area, anglers pull their gear, slowly move away, and stay away until the whales leave. It's very, very simple. It's much easier than the very complex type of regulations that we've been looking at. It's almost to the state in some of the areas where these have been imposed, like Port Renfrew and like the Southern Gulf Islands, that anglers are joking that you literally need a lawyer on board to understand what the regulations actually are. So when you compare that to a regulation regime where you simply have to remember whales show up, pull your fishing gear, stop fishing, and move a prescribed distance away until they leave, and then you can go back and fish again, that can be applied anywhere on the coast. The correlation between southern resident killer whales and the prey, in this case primarily Chinook, is pretty tight. When there has been an abundance of Chinook, the whales have responded accordingly. When Chinook stocks have been low, the whale population has declined. So that relationship is pretty tight, and we don't actually argue with that on the recreational side. What we do argue with is the prescription that they have chosen to follow, and with, frankly, the data that they've been using. In spite of the advice that they've received from guides who've been on the water for 10, 20, 30 years, these are fishing guides, in spite of the advice that they've received from fishermen who have indicated that these areas that you've shut down for 3.5 to 4 months, that the whales are rarely in them at all, doesn't seem to be taking hold with the folks that are running the recovery program. And again, this is not just the recreational angler's position or feeling. It's supported by a group from the San Juan Islands called the Orca Behavior Institute. They're one of the longest running groups that have been studying these southern killer whales. And they took a look at the Canadian plan, which is based on static closures, and said, no, we don't think that one works too well. Because in the U.S., on the U.S. side of the border, they have regulations that are very similar to what we've been proposing for years, which is the moving avoidance bubble. There are solutions to get us out of this mess. And I suggest most strongly we've shut down recreational fisheries in key fishing areas for no reason in terms of the killer whales specifically, because there are good options, but there's also options to protect the upper Fraser River Chinook. And here it involves mass marking of hatchery-produced salmon, which simply means at the hatcheries they will mark a high percentage of Chinook salmon with adipose fin clips. The government has 2 trailers where they do the marking. They have 2 more on order, but they've been slow walking this operation for years. And the reason this is so important is because if anglers can retain these highly visible, easy to identify fin-clipped salmon, and it includes coho as well, if we can retain those, it takes the pressure off the wild fish, because The wild fish aren't the ones that have the marks, so they have an opportunity to get back to their home streams and spawn successfully. It's also important to have these marked fish, because when the fish get into their home rivers, people who are working on those rivers, people, for example, maybe you have a small community hatchery, are able to identify the marked salmon from the unmarked salmon, so that they're not mixing hatchery and wild fish when they're doing their work at the hatchery and selecting their brood stock. The other important component is when anglers can't keep fish that are marked, DFO loses all of the coded wire tagged data, because these marked fish, or a significant proportion of them, have implanted in them a little coded wire tag that gives all of the information, all the background, where they came from, what the river was. There's all kinds of data that's going missing now because we don't have marked selective fisheries. They are moving slowly towards this, or at least they say so. But it's been painfully slow. And I know that the recreational advisors have been asking for this for many, many years. It appears now that they are slowly going to move in that direction. But the important thing to understand is that if they started this year, they started right now, it would be 3 years before you could take advantage of any of those fisheries. So there's another 3 years to go down the road. It also means that we can't retain U.S. marked fish, which in some areas of Juan de Fuca Strait and southern Georgia Strait make up anywhere from 70 to 80% of the abundance of fish that are there, principally in the late winter and spring up till about mid-May till the end of May. It's really to our disadvantage that marked selective fisheries are not in operation right now. Interestingly enough, by comparison, the U.S. is way ahead of us. They mark 100% of all of the Chinook and coho by law as part of their Chinook and coho recovery program. Currently, Canada marks about 15%, and that might be generous. There are solutions to these problems that we're facing, and they're not that difficult. The first thing that government has to do is that they have to accelerate the upper Fraser River assistance, which has been sadly lacking for most of the last 15 years. And that means get the resources there, get the technical support there, get the manpower there, and get the hatcheries that you need up and running on at least a short-term basis to boost these stocks so that they get over the hump and they're no longer creating a problem for us. The second thing is to get on with the mass marking and the marked selective fisheries. If we don't have those, it's going to be very difficult down the road to sustain any type of fishery in Juan de Fuca or Georgia Strait. And there are a number of reasons for that. The most pressing one is that as the abundance goes up, if we can't retain these fish, we're going to run into what's called a hooking release mortality problem. That in order to find a marked fish, you're going to have to catch 10 or 15 that aren't marked, and then you get into this question of the number of those that die. So the other thing is to move to the moving avoidance bubble that we talked about as the primary strategy for protecting southern resident killer whales. But here's the other important things where anglers can help us out. Get politically active. That means contact your MLA or your MP, specifically your MP. Say, look, we can save these whales, we can save Upper Fraser River Chinook, and we can save recreational fisheries, but you guys have got to help us. And so far, that is the main political thrust in terms of where we have to go. It means join and support an angling group, a conservation group, for example, like the South Vancouver Island Anglers Coalition, who, by the way, using their own money, have raised, I think it's 5 to 6 million Chinook salmon, primarily for additional feed for southern resident killer whales when they're in Juan de Fuca Strait. But these guys need support. They need your volunteer support. They need financial support. And in order to do that, we're going to need help from people who have interests in recreational fishing. So you can volunteer, you can join a group, word of mouth support, or financial support. And that will help us move down the road a lot quicker and a lot further than we would be if we didn't have that help from you.